GMB's Susanna Reid loses it at Chris Packham as they clash in furious "Just Stop Oil." Row. Good morning. Britain turned heated as Susanna Reid clashed with Chris Packham over the length of prison sentences handed to Just Stop Oil protesters. Good morning. Britain presenter Susanna Reid clashed with Chris Packham as a row over Just Stop Oil. Protesters turned heated. Alongside co-host Richard Madeley, Susanna spoke to the Springwatch star, who joined protesters outside London's High Court on Wednesday, January 29th. Just Stop Oil activists staged a protest to block the street outside the court as 16 jailed eco-activists mounted appeals against their record-breaking prison sentences. Roger Hallam, the leader of Just Stop Oil, is among those appealing after he was jailed for 5 years for his involvement in a conspiracy to cause mass gridlock on the M25. Supporting the protest was Chris, who argued that criminals who convict violent or sexual offenses are handed lesser sentences. During the interview, Susanna shared the devastating impacts that Just Stop Oil protesters have had on members of the public, explaining how a patient suffering with an aggressive form of cancer missed an appointment and had to wait 2 months for another one. The presenter also revealed that an HGV driver was unable to deliver $5,000 worth of food to a hospital. Hitting out at the protesters' actions, Susanna said, "If you even put aside the emergency services, you had a direct impact on people's health and well-being." The 63-year-old environmentalist campaigner hit back. "I don't seek to put the emergency services to one side. I'm here to acknowledge that all of these things are an inconvenience, and some of them, as you've highlighted, are potentially life-threatening and dangerous. I'm asking you to think about scale. You've seen what's happened in California. We've witnessed on your program the flooding all over the world that has taken people's lives, and this is down to our predicament when it comes to climate." As Susanna attempted to interject, Chris shut her down as he declared, "One thing I will say, Susanna." But the GMB host wasn't backing down as she said, "I was going to say, peaceful protests are okay. Of course everyone supports that right. The point is, you're standing outside courts. Criminal protests are not okay," she later added. "We still have to uphold the law." Tensions rise on Good Morning Britain. The bright lights of the Good Morning Britain studio shone down on the sleek, modern set as Susanna Reid and Richard Madeley prepared to grill their latest guest. The day's hot-button issue? The controversial Just Stop Oil protests that had resulted in unprecedented prison sentences for the activists involved. Seated opposite them was Chris Packham, the renowned environmentalist and wildlife presenter who had thrown his support behind the protesters. His expression was calm but resolute, a stark contrast to Susanna's barely contained frustration. "We're talking about people's lives being disrupted in severe ways," Susanna began, her voice controlled but pointed. "We had a cancer patient who missed a vital appointment because of these protests. An HGV driver was unable to deliver essential food supplies to a hospital. How do you justify that?" Chris sighed, steepling his fingers. "Susanna, I don't dismiss those impacts. They are unfortunate. But let's talk about the bigger picture here. Climate change is not a future problem. It is happening now. Lives are being lost due to extreme weather, floods, and wildfires. The question we should be asking is not, why are these people protesting, but why do they feel they have no other choice?" Richard Madeley leaned in, eyebrows raised. "Chris, come on, there are lawful ways to protest. Why support actions that cause mass disruption?" Chris met his gaze evenly, because lawful protests have been ignored for decades. The science is clear, yet the government refuses to act at the necessary scale. These sentences, 5 years for peaceful protest, are a dangerous precedent. Are we saying disrupting? Traffic is worse than violent crime. Chapter 2. The breaking point, Susanna's grip on her pen tightened. "We still have to uphold the law, Chris. Criminal protests are not okay." Chris shook his head, his voice rising. "Then why is the law punishing peaceful activists more harshly than some violent offenders? Why is Roger Hallam facing 5 Years for trying to wake people up to an existential threat? Susanna's patience snapped. Because he endangered lives, Chris. You keep talking about scale, but tell that to the cancer patient who missed her appointment. Tell that to the mother who couldn't reach her child in an emergency. You don't get to decide whose lives are more important. Chris's composure finally cracked. And neither do you, Susanna. But if we do nothing, billions will suffer. These protests are desperate measures because we are running out of time. How do you not see that? Richard cleared his throat, attempting to mediate. All right, let's take a step back here. But Susanna was undeterred. Chris, you keep shifting the blame. The government's response is one thing, but that doesn't absolve Just Stop Oil from responsibility. There's a right way and a wrong way to fight for change. Chris exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're missing the point. The right way has failed. We are in crisis. What's happening in California, the floods, the fires. You report on these disasters, but you refuse to connect the dots. Chapter 3. The Fallout. The tension in the studio was palpable. Social media exploded, with viewers taking sides. Susanna vs. Chris trended within minutes, with people fiercely debating who was right. Some praised Susanna for holding Packham accountable for the collateral damage of the protests, while others defended Chris, arguing that climate change demanded urgent action. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled. The segment had gone longer than scheduled, but the explosive exchange had captured the audience's attention, like few interviews before. As the show cut to a commercial break, Chris removed his microphone, standing with a sigh. Susanna, I respect your passion, but we have to wake up before it's too late. Susanna, still fuming, replied, and I respect yours, but we can't ignore the consequences of these actions. Richard Madeley, ever the peacemaker, clapped, a hand on Chris's shoulder. Let's hope we can find a middle ground before it's too late for both the planet and civil discourse. Chris gave a wry smile. That's what I fear. We don't have time for middle ground anymore. As he left the studio, the debate raged on, both on screen and in homes across the country. One thing was certain: the climate crisis was not just a scientific issue. It was a battle of ethics, law, and human impact, and there were no easy answers.